Today I'm going to show you 5 different methods for applique. I've got some bonder web or fusible webbing and some freezer paper, and I'm going to draw some designs on my freezer paper to start with. The 5 methods are freezer paper, needle turn, reverse applique, raw edge and bagging out. So I'm going to go through each and show you the results as we go. But to work my sampler, I'm just going to draw a few circles on freezer paper to start with. As you can see, I'm drawing on the matte side of the freezer paper, not the shiny side, because the shiny side, when you iron the matte side, the shiny side adheres to the fabric temporarily. So the first method I'm going to show you is the freezer paper method. So I'm going to iron a roughly cut out circle of freezer paper onto my applique fabric. As you can see, that's adhered. And I'm going to roughly cut out, again with a seam allowance, the shape. This is just a rough cut at the moment, so don't worry about it too much. Now we're going to machine stitch that with a straight stitch, quite a short stitch, 2.2, 2.6, something like that. So machine stitch your drawn line, and this will be the size of your applique patch. And then remove your paper. That will just tear off very easily. You're just going to tear it along the stitch lines. And once you turn it off, just make sure you haven't got any tiny bits of paper caught in your stitches. Trim the shape, so about 3mm, 4mm seam allowance from the stitching. Now that stitching is going to act as a really nice guide for pressing the shape. It's going to press along that stitch line, giving us a lovely, crisp, clear, curved circle. So it's all ready for sewing onto your base fabric. So I'm coming up from the back to the front along that pressed edge, holding it in place and doing tiny slip stitches. So I'm going into the base fabric and then sliding along and then back up through the applique patch. And if your fabrics come undone from the ironing, you can just turn it back under. So I love this method. It's a nice, accurate method, and I like the guide by the machine stitching. Makes it easy to press. That's the finished outcome. The next method is the needle turn method. To be honest, this is very similar, but you don't have the stitch lines to guide you. So again, you can see I'm using freezer paper and I'm cutting out my shape. But I'm cutting out the exact shape I want, no seam allowance allowed now. And I'm going to iron that to my applique fabric, and then I'll cut out a seam allowance of again 3 to 4mm around the shape. And I'm going to cut the middle out, again with a seam allowance. Now when I've done that, I'm going to press it in those edges. As you can see, for this method I'm using the freezer paper as a guide for turning in the raw edges. In the middle, because I've got tighter curves, I am just snipping into that seam allowance, and that's going to make it easier to turn and press. So I'm going to remove the freezer paper. So there I've got my pressed shape for the applique. I'm just going to add a splash of colour underneath my cutout circle there. And then, so with the needle turn, you're turning the fabric under like that with your needle. As you go around the shape, your pressed edge will act as a guide and make this process easier for you. And again, you're doing the slip stitch as you did for the freezer paper method. So there you have it, that's the needle turn method of applique. Next we're going to do reverse applique. I'm just ironing some iron-on interfacing onto the back of my sampler. This is just going to make the fabric much more stable and fray a lot less when complete. I've adhered with a glue stick a patch of fabric on the back in the colour I want to reveal. And on the front I've adhered some freezer paper with my design as a guide for stitching. And I'm doing a running stitch, again a small running stitch, around the pencil shape, which acts as a good guide. So my applique fabric on the back, I made sure it fitted this space. So again, I'm going to tear the freezer paper off. And then you can see my stitch lines. Now I've removed the freezer paper. Now I'm just going to cut through the top fabric, being careful not to cut the bottom fabric, and stitch close to this, cut close to the stitch line. So it's about 1 mil away from the stitch line here. And as you can see, I've chosen to stitch in the patch colour beneath rather than the blue or the sampler. Obviously that's totally up to you what colour stitching you're doing will give different effects. So there you have it, that's reverse applique. So next up we're going to do raw edge applique. This is quite possibly the quickest method. So I've got bond web or fusible webbing there under the iron, just making sure that's adhered nicely. Now I'm going to cut out my desired shape. And I'm going to peel the paper off to reveal the webbing glue underneath. And then I'm going to iron it in place. It is sensible to use a piece of parchment paper or baking paper to protect your iron between that and the applique sample. As you can see, I just went for it. But if you get any of the webbing glue on your iron, it will melt and stick. So be warned. Next up, you're going to zigzag around your edge. You need a tight zigzag for this, and you might want to practice on a couple of scraps first, just to make sure you're happy with the closeness of the zigzag stitching. So we have it, I just snipped my loose ends. Next up, bagging out method, the last method. So you need 2 pieces of your applique fabric. Again, I'm using freezer paper as a guide, you don't need to. Just holding my 2 pieces of fabric together, and I'm going to machine stitch round the edge. You may need to lower your needle and pivot by lifting the presser foot, turning the fabric, and then re-lowering the foot. So once you've gone around your edge and you've removed freezer paper if you've used it as a guide, You're going to trim your seam allowance nice and small. And then pull your two sides apart so you can just snip into one side, and basically you're making a big enough cut that you can pull the fabric through and bag it out like you do if you're fabric making. So let's just turn the shape through that gap so that the raw edges are on the inside of the shape. Any second it'll just come together. So once you've got it turned through, you just need to push out along the seam. It might help to cut into the seam allowance a little just to make that easier turn. So I'm just making sure I've turned out just along the stitched line. I'm just pulling out any bits that haven't quite turned through neatly. Then we're going to give it a good press and place onto our base fabric with a slit, obviously not showing. And then you're going to machine stitch round. You can obviously do a straight stitch, a zigzag stitch. If your machine's got a blanket stitch, you could do that, or you could hand blanket stitch. The choice is up to you. So this is the bagging out method. I hope you've enjoyed this whistle stop tour of 5 different methods of applique and are excited to get going with your own projects. If you've liked the video, don't forget to click like and subscribe for further videos. Thanks for watching.